Professor Thomas Finholt. This is the Dean of School of Information, University of Michigan and Arbor. So, the whole era of privacy laws are changing around the world, and Europe is being much more stricter as compared to the US. How do you see now the e-laws moving, both either globally in the US?
I think the spirit of the laws is a good one. That there are predatory aspects of these platforms that can be very damaging to individuals and the security of their information. I guess I would draw an exception to the focus in the EU on trying to write legislation and regulation to anticipate all possible contingency and reflect more on efforts that would focus on creating a normative structure around behavior such that doing things like compromising people's privacy would just not be something one would think of. And I think these kind of normative campaigns can have a greater staying power than, say, the force of regulation. So take, for example, tobacco cessation. I think the stigmatization of smoking in the United States did a lot more to non-smoking than any amount of, say, regulatory pressure. Or you could argue that the stigmatization, along with the tax structure on cigarettes, made it expensive to start, and the fact that it wasn't cool to do it made it difficult to keep doing it. And I think, we need to be in a position where these large enterprises don't start thinking that their first step should be to, pirate all of people's individual data. And I think we would get further with a cultural movement that said that such preying on individuals' data is inappropriate, rather than relying on a regulatory forward, which could be naive, but I tend to think that norms in the end are always a more potent force than even the force of law can be, and you just need to create mores and practices around data handling that are the same as things that you would have instantiated in the culture around how one behaves towards strangers, or like, I'm not going to walk into your house and steal things. Sure, there's a body of law that would punish me for doing that, but it's the kind of the instruction and the normative orientation that keeps me from doing that more than, say, any fear of potential punishment. So it's all which is to say, I understand the impulse of the EU regulators. I just am not always certain that trying to anticipate every possible exclusion is an effective approach. I also think when you create a regulatory bulwark like that, you compel a reaction and response that probably makes progress more difficult than easier, if you understand my meaning there.
You also, you have your authority on social computing. Now, technology has both its positives and the negatives. And, there was a recent study by UN which says that technology could be a huge addiction, especially the social media. There are a lot of, it builds on you, and there are a lot of negative effects, including it gets to a stage where people get depressed also. What are your thoughts here? And how should we judiciously use technology in social space, and what measures should we take to be very careful of, it not going to a level where we are totally dependent on them?
Yeah, so I think this is a domain again where there can be some degree of normative suasion or instruction, if you will. So the analogy I would draw is when I was in grade school, they showed us 16 millimeter films that were sort of how to behave in public settings, how to talk to strangers, how to welcome people into your home, whatever, right? And we don't really have any similar kind of instruction or guidance with respect to social media because it's so new and it emerged so rapidly. We didn't have time to sort of parse out what the rules of the road would be. And I think now we've got to do some backtracking to reintroduce some of those standards. And, particularly you look at the way adolescent users are sharing all kinds of things that for older people would be horrifying to consider as in the public realm. I think some of that stuff is
it must be terrifying for you. Life has changed so much from your end. Do you think that, how the leverage, how the technology is enabling different social media outlets, you think that's changed a lot?
Yeah, the point that was made in the panel at the beginning, Scott said it's possible for some enterprising 12-year-old to assemble all of the components that she needs to build, a massive presence or an identity or what have you on, say, a platform like YouTube and that kind of a thing. That's a tremendous power, and that power could be used for good, particularly if you are demonstrating some, set of practices related to hygiene and care of, newborn infants and things like that could be critical in reducing infant mortality. But, the things that enable those pro-social outcomes also are the basis for a lot of these antisocial things. And I think from the point of view of the antisocial aspects, those are probably best addressed through a kind of a normative guidance, where again you think about how might you stigmatize these kinds of uses, such as Bollywood stars not modeling the behavior that you find to be destructive. And when you eliminated smoking on screen, you see corresponding decline in smoking rates in the population. I think there's a lot you can do through that sort of suasion that we're not fully exploring at the moment. Themselves modeling behaviors, I don't think we have very good exemplars of that in the United States right now around social media. But you could imagine some future where Twitter isn't weaponized against your opponents. And that kind of. So one of our big thrusts at Michigan right now is trying to think about this environment of social media and what are the correlates of its toxicity, and how can we apply research findings in a manner that addresses that toxicity. So we created the Center for Social Media Responsibility in part to develop measures that would allow us to index some of the dysfunction, and then, by indexing that dysfunction, you identify it, and then can develop interventions and be able to see whether those interventions are resulting in change. So it turns out, for example, in comment fields, rather than having a thumbs up or a thumbs down, if you just had a third category that might be something like that's reasonable, or I understand why you say that could mitigate some of the hostility that emerges in these settings, where right now the stakes are almost always set up as an us versus them kind of thing, and then a race to the bottom in terms of who can say the nastiest thing about the other side. And these design features, which is what they are, we've known about them for 30 years. We're just not being very proactive about getting the word out about the application of these things. And, in Michigan, we're training the people that will be the product designers for these products, and we're trying to instill in them some sense of responsibility about this awesome power that they are unleashing in some of these platforms. And I think that I'm optimistic about the future, because I think they will have the guidance to make decisions that won't unleash all of these unpleasant secondary consequences. I think Facebook, we'd have been a lot better off with a subscription model at Facebook than an ad-driven model, because that might not have led to this, race to the bottom in terms of attention kind of thing.
views. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.